The paper on the massage table rustled beneath my cheek as I exhaled slowly through my nose, the scent of peppermint and eucalyptus wrapping around me like steam rising from a hot mug on a winter morning. And I told myself again that this was normal, that this was clinical, that this was exactly what my husband had insisted I needed when he scheduled the appointment, without asking if I even had the time, calling it a surprise, calling it self-care, and I hadn't argued because saying no felt like rejecting kindness, even though I was already suspicious of anything labeled a treat that came with a calendar notification. I lay perfectly still, listening to the faint shuffle of his feet across the polished floor as he approached from behind with the same quiet confidence I remembered from the week before, his hands pausing just above my shoulder blades before they made contact, and the instant they did, I noticed the chill, the kind that made the skin ripple ever so slightly before adjusting to the pressure. And I focused on the ceiling tile directly beneath my line of vision, and told myself again that this was fine, that his touch was professional, that everything would stay within bounds because he had a license and a reputation, and a calm voice that made even the word tightness sound like meditation. His hands moved with practiced skill along my spine, and I could tell he understood tension in a way that went beyond textbook knowledge, reading it from posture and breath and the subtle ways my body responded. When his hands reached the base of my back, instead of moving to another area as I expected, his touch lingered in a way that felt deliberately intimate, and though the movement could still be considered professional, there was something in the timing that made the atmosphere in the room shift noticeably. I didn't speak, didn't flinch, but my body reacted the way it does when something confusing begins to unfold and your instinct tightens before your logic catches up. And in that split-second pause where his hands stayed still, pressing into the soft curve at the top of my hips, he leaned in close enough for his voice to reach my ear, speaking words that were meant to sound professional but carried an undertone that made me uncomfortable. "Relax," he said in a low voice. "I can sense your tension." But the way he said it felt too personal for a therapeutic setting. I stayed silent, choosing stillness over reaction, hoping he would move on, hoping the heat rushing to my face didn't reach my skin in a way he could read. And when his hands finally lifted, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, steady and silent, like someone trying not to give anything away. It had all started with my husband watching me wince while loading the dishwasher, commenting offhandedly about my posture, then standing in the doorway with his phone out saying he knew just the guy and already had a time slot booked because Nathan, yes, Nathan, he used his name like he knew him personally, was an absolute miracle worker, the kind of guy who didn't just rub shoulders but actually reset spines and fixed what chiropractors couldn't, and I didn't have the energy to argue or research alternatives. The first session had been nothing but standard, low lights, mellow jazz humming through the ceiling speakers, the smell of tea tree and menthol drifting like memory foam, and Nathan himself had been distant and focused, asking polite but minimal questions about injuries and stress, wearing a black polo, with the club's embroidered logo and gray joggers that suggested he'd walked out of a fitness magazine shoot, his voice rarely rising above a steady murmur. And when the hour ended, I had left the room feeling looser and almost foolish for being so wary. But the second appointment brought small but visible changes, like the moment he rolled up his sleeves before starting, exposing forearms that didn't belong to someone who spent his life behind a desk, or the way he commented almost absent-mindedly during the session saying, "You're soft, but you fight it," in a tone that felt more like observation than feedback. And I couldn't quite decide if it was meant to be clinical, or if it had slipped from another version of him I hadn't met yet. Nathan was 32. I later overheard him tell someone in the reception area, a former swimmer with national training experience and a certificate in something that sounded impressive and probably was, and he didn't speak unless prompted, but when he did, he held eye contact, like it was a conversation even when only one of us was talking. And I remember thinking that he had the kind of face you don't find attractive until you realize you're staring at it longer than you meant to. His studio was always a few degrees warmer than the rest of the building, with neatly folded towels, stacked beside a small diffuser that glowed pale amber, and filled the room with alternating scents of mint and black pepper, and I began to anticipate that moment when he'd lay the heated towel across my back with such careful precision that it felt less like a routine and more like an offering, especially when he lifted it again and placed his hands directly where the warmth had been, as if borrowing the heat to press deeper into the tissue. The third time I came in, something shifted again. Not in what he did exactly, but in how it felt. Because when I turned onto my back as he instructed, he paused before adjusting the headrest and said softly, "Keep your eyes closed. I don't need to see them. I can read what I need from the way you breathe." And for a moment, I almost asked him to repeat it just to be sure I hadn't imagined the intimacy tucked inside a sentence that wasn't supposed to mean anything. I smiled, but only slightly. And not because I was comfortable, not because I felt understood or seen, or any of the things that wellness influencers promised came from being present and aligned with your body, but because the room had shifted and I knew it. Because the way he spoke wasn't clinical, and the way his hands moved wasn't routine anymore, and the smile was a mask I didn't even realize I had reached for until it was already in place. Already protecting me from how exposed I suddenly felt in a space that was supposed to be safe. I kept my eyes shut as he worked, not because he told me to, but because I didn't want to see his expression, didn't want to wonder what he looked like while saying the things he said, or where his gaze landed when I breathed in deeper than usual, or what he noticed when my skin flushed from the heat of his palms pressing just beneath my collarbone with a slowness that felt intentional, as if he was waiting for me to flinch or sigh or do something that would confirm I wasn't just a client anymore, but something else entirely, though I had no idea what that was or how we had gotten here. By the time he finished, my muscles felt like they had been wrung out and draped over a railing to dry, heavy and quiet and not entirely my own. And as I sat up and gathered my clothes and moved toward the door, I felt that strange pull in my chest, that mix of nerves and something unspoken. And I hated how it lingered because it didn't feel like fear, but it didn't feel right either. And I walked out into the hallway hoping I looked normal, hoping my face wasn't giving anything away. My husband was parked out front with the engine running and the radio low, scrolling his phone while the heater blew across the windshield. And when I climbed into the passenger seat, he smiled and leaned over to kiss the side of my head. The kind of automatic affection you learn to appreciate once you've been married long enough to know how rare it is when things are calm. And I let the kiss land on my temple without moving away too quickly. But I didn't lean into it either. And somewhere in that half-second delay, I knew something had changed even if I didn't have the words for it yet. The next morning, I saw the notification in the app, the one the club uses for appointments and wellness tips and occasional coupons for smoothies or yoga mats. And at first, I assumed it was a system reminder or a confirmation, something harmless and functional. But when I opened it, I saw his name in small gray letters and beneath it a single sentence that made my heart slow down and then speed up again before I could take a full breath. You exhale so quietly when I touch beneath your clavicle. It's a beautiful sound. His message was highly inappropriate, commenting on my physical responses during what should have been a professional session. I stared at the screen for a long time, rereading the message in disbelief, and I didn't respond because any reply would have encouraged behavior that had already crossed professional boundaries. And even though I could have blocked him, could have deleted the message or reported it, or told myself this was the moment to draw a clear line, I didn't do any of that. I just locked my phone and slipped it face down into my bag and tried to forget how my skin had tingled reading words that weren't supposed to be said by someone who only ever saw me in athletic shorts and a towel. But something shifted after that message. Not just in the air between us, but in me too, because the next time I booked, I found myself checking my hair in the mirror before I left, curling the front pieces slightly, so they framed my face even though I knew I'd be lying, face down for most of the session, and I picked out the new two-piece athletic set I hadn't worn yet. The one in muted olive with a zip-up hoodie that hugged just enough to notice but not enough to accuse, and I dabbed a little tinted moisturizer on my cheeks even though I told myself I wasn't getting dressed up for anyone. When I stepped out of the bedroom, my husband looked up from the kitchen where he was making coffee and said, "That color looks good on you," with a nod that was part compliment and part surprise, and I smiled the way women do when they've already left the room emotionally. Just nodded once without looking at him directly, adjusting my bag strap like I was heading into battle instead of a massage. On the drive there, I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that this was just attention after months of feeling invisible, that Nathan probably said things like that to all his clients, that I was the one reading too much into something that was probably harmless. But as I stepped into that warm room again, as the scent of mint and black pepper hit me in the chest like memory and heat, I realized I had already crossed some invisible line before I even walked through the door, because I hadn't told my husband about the message, and I knew I wouldn't. The next session began without the usual warm-up strokes along my shoulders or the polite check-in about pressure or sensitivity, because this time Nathan started at the small of my back, his palms pressing slowly and deliberately into the base of my spine as if anchoring me to the table. And instead of moving outward as before, he worked upward in a single, unbroken line, dragging his hands with careful force toward the space between my shoulder blades, while his thumbs traced the edges of my ribs without hesitation. And it was then that he said in that same low, steady voice that never asked permission, only made statements that sounded like truths, "Your center isn't here today," which made no clinical sense but still landed in a way that felt undeniable, as if he wasn't referring to posture or muscle strain but something deeper and more private that I hadn't meant to expose. I kept my eyes shut as he moved higher, his hands following the column of my spine as if it were a path he knew intimately, each vertebra a step toward something he understood better than I did. And when his fingers reached the curve at the base of my neck and then the ridge of my skull just above it, he paused in a way that felt almost reverent, his thumbs brushing lightly along the tension held in the base of my head. And the contact wasn't firm this time. Not therapeutic or corrective or technical, but soft and strangely gentle, like the way someone touches a sleeping child or a loved one lost in thought. And I felt my breath catch because I couldn't pretend anymore that this was normal. Then, in that exact stillness, with his hands resting like punctuation against my scalp and his breath moving so quietly above me that I wasn't sure if I felt it or imagined it, he whispered the words that tilted the ground beneath everything I had rationalized until now. Not loud, not harsh, but too clear to mistake as anything other than personal, when he said, "You're not tense in your body. You're tense in your decision." And it wasn't advice or suggestion. It was an accusation spoken like a confession, and I felt my lashes part without permission as I opened my eyes just enough to see the blurry edge of the towel below me, the floor tiles far away, the light filtering across the ceiling like a secret held too long. I didn't answer him. Not out loud, because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't make the room collapse in on itself, nothing I could offer that would be received as neutral or misunderstood as polite. So I stayed silent with my face turned to the side, eyes halfway open and breath held between questions I didn't want to ask. And Nathan didn't speak again, but I knew that he'd seen my reaction, knew that his words had landed because his fingers pressed slightly deeper into the hollow at the base of my skull before finally pulling away like a decision he'd let me make for now. That day should have ended like the others. Quiet and slow, and contained inside the walls of that softly lit room, but as I stepped out into the hallway and reached for the tie on my jacket, I heard my husband's voice before I saw him, low and calm but with that clipped rhythm he used when something felt off, asking the receptionist if his wife was finished with her appointment yet, saying he'd gotten off work early and thought it would be a nice surprise to pick me up instead of waiting in the car like usual. I froze for a second just outside the door, still hidden by the angle of the hallway, and I heard her voice respond that I was still in the massage suite, just a few minutes over the hour, and my pulse shot up because I knew he'd walk back toward the room, knew that door wasn't locked, and for the first time I realized that this was the kind of moment when something dangerous could snap into view if the timing went just a little wrong. But Nathan had already moved. And when my husband reached the threshold of the room, the door swung open slowly, and there Nathan stood, folding the massage towels with deliberate calm, one in each hand, his face unreadable but composed. The light behind him casting a warm glow across the room that made everything look too quiet to be suspicious. And I was sitting upright on the edge of the table, my legs crossed at the ankle and my hands in my lap, my hair loose over my shoulders, because I hadn't bothered to reclip it. And I saw the way my husband took it in without asking anything, his eyes catching on the undone edge of the blanket and the flush still on my cheeks. And though he didn't say a word in that moment, I felt the weight of what he noticed land between us like an envelope waiting to be opened. After that session, I told myself I wouldn't come back, that whatever this was had bent too far away from intention and too close toward danger, but the next week I opened the locker where I usually kept my shoes and found a cream-colored card tucked into the side slot, folded in half with no name and no decoration, and when I opened it, the handwriting was careful and slanted, and it read, "Only, if you could see the way your neck arches when you forget you have a husband," which made my stomach twist and my fingers clench and my breath stop just long enough to feel real fear. I threw it away before I could think, shoved it deep into the studio trash under a pile of paper towels and empty water cups. But 15 minutes later, I came back and pulled it out again, wiping the corner clean with a tissue, before tucking it into the side pocket of my purse like something I had no business keeping, but couldn't leave behind. That was the moment I knew this had stopped being confusion. It had become a choice I was making in silence. The next time, when the appointment reminder pinged and I walked into that same scented hallway, with the same towel tucked under my arm and the same knot low in my stomach, I felt the weight of the card in my purse even though I hadn't looked at it since. And I told myself I'd be stronger this time, more guarded, more clinical, more everything I should have been already. But the second the door clicked shut behind me and the lights dimmed and Nathan turned around with that same unreadable calm in his eyes, I realized I hadn't come here to be neutral. The massage was quiet, the room even warmer than usual, and his touch more focused than it had ever been, more methodical in some areas but strangely absent in others, as if he was testing which rules he could bend and which ones he already knew I wouldn't enforce. And when the hour ended and I sat up to tie my hair back, still flushed from the heat and the silence and the weight of what hadn't been said, he handed me a bottle of water the way he always did. But this time when I reached for it, his fingers made contact with my wrist and lingered there in a way that was clearly intentional. The touch was gentle but deliberately intimate, and then he spoke in a way that made it clear this was no longer about massage therapy, acknowledging that we had crossed into inappropriate territory, and I didn't flinch, didn't pull back, didn't do anything but hold the water and feel the silence grow around us like a curtain dropped too late to hide what had already happened. Because the truth was I didn't want to say stop, not because I couldn't, not because I was confused, but because part of me had started waiting for these moments, like someone waits for a door to open, even when they know they shouldn't walk through it. Went home that night and stood in the shower for longer than I needed, the water too hot and my hands pressed against the tile like I was trying to wash off something invisible, and I told myself I had to stop going, had to block him, had to find another studio or make an excuse or do anything other than go back. But the next morning I confirmed the next appointment without hesitation, and the worst part was I felt relief when I saw the confirmation screen. But something broke on the day I arrived early, something small and private and stupid because I hadn't planned to say anything, hadn't even known what I was feeling until I stepped into the room 10 minutes before the hour and found him still arranging the oils on the shelf. And I dropped my bag onto the chair harder than I meant to and said, without looking at him, "I'm not ready for the session today." And the words felt flat and weak and unconvincing the second they left my mouth, but I didn't take them back. He didn't respond right away, just turned slightly and let his eyes move over me like he was adjusting to a different version of the same picture. And then he walked closer. Not enough to crowd, but enough to shift the air between us, and said, "That's fine." Then paused just long enough for it to feel deliberate before adding, "I'm ready to hear everything you won't say." And the way he said it didn't sound seductive or manipulative or even kind, it just sounded true. And in that moment, I felt something push forward in me that I hadn't wanted to name. I should have walked out then, should have picked up my bag and left without speaking, but instead I stood there frozen by my own heartbeat, by the stillness in the room, by the hum of something between us that had started small and grown louder each time we stayed quiet. And then without thinking clearly about the consequences, I placed my hand against his chest. I told myself I was establishing boundaries, but the contact lingered in a way that made it clear we had both crossed professional lines, and when he responded by covering my hand with his own, it became obvious that this was mutual and no longer appropriate, and neither of us spoke because there was nothing left to clarify. The contact lasted only seconds but stretched out like something permanent, and when I finally pulled my hand away and turned toward the table, he didn't follow or stop me. And the rest of the session passed without a single word or pause or touch that crossed the line again, but I didn't forget the pressure of his palm over mine or the weight of my own silence as I left the room that afternoon. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness thick and unmoving as my husband shifted beside me, his breathing slow and even and unaware, and when he rolled toward me and placed a hand on my hip, I flinched just enough for him to notice, and he whispered, "Still not sleeping?" with real concern in his voice, and I nodded slowly, not because of insomnia or stress or anything he would understand, but because it wasn't the dreams that disturbed me anymore. It was the space between them. The room was completely still. When I entered, not the usual warmth of soft music floating under the hum of the diffuser, not the carefully curated soundscape of trickling water and ambient tones meant to lull the senses into false security. Just silence so thick it felt intentional, like a blanket pressed too tightly around the ribs, and as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me with a quiet click, I knew that today wasn't going to follow any pattern I could convince myself was routine or accidental or therapeutic. I lay down on the table with practiced movement, letting the towel slide into place, letting my arms fall limp at my sides, and I didn't speak because the words had dried up somewhere between the hallway and the padded cushion beneath me. And he didn't speak either, didn't ask how I was feeling or if there were any new areas of tension, didn't greet or explain or ease into the session with the professionalism I used to pretend was the only thing he offered, and the silence between us crackled like static held inside skin. I heard his footsteps approach, soft and measured like always, and I focused on the rhythm of my own breathing, tried to anchor myself in the steady expansion of my ribs, but when his fingers touched my lower back with that now familiar slowness, there was no shock or surprise, only the heavy inevitability of something that had already begun long before either of us said yes to it. His hands moved slowly upward from the base of my spine, gliding without hesitation across the curve of my waist and the flat plane between my ribs. And I didn't flinch or shift because there was nothing unfamiliar in his touch anymore. Nothing left to pretend was just part of a professional service, because every inch of contact was deliberate, and every pause was heavy with meaning. And even in the silence, I felt more spoken to than I had in weeks. When he asked me to turn, his voice was steady but quieter than usual, like he knew that words now had weight we couldn't afford to waste. And I rolled onto my back with a smooth, practiced movement, letting the towel slide slightly out of place, without fixing it. And when I looked up at him, he didn't meet my eyes, just stepped to the side and rested his palm low on my abdomen, not with force or pressure, but with a presence that felt heavier than the hand itself. It wasn't massage anymore. It wasn't manipulation of muscle or guided touch meant to restore mobility or relieve pain. It was contact that pinned me to the table more with implication than weight, a hand that said, "I see you, I choose this," and I knew that my silence wasn't passive, it was permission, and I felt my body tighten not in resistance but in recognition of a line we were already stepping over. What happened next crossed every professional boundary imaginable, as he moved into a position that was clearly intimate rather than therapeutic. I should have stopped what was happening, should have reasserted professional boundaries, but instead I found myself responding in a way that made it clear this had become consensual but completely inappropriate behavior. He moved upward with unbearable slowness, pressing a kiss beneath my left breast, then the space just above it, and I felt my breath stutter in a way I hadn't allowed it to in years, sharp and broken and entirely outside my control. And when I gripped his shirt tighter and pulled gently at the back of his neck, my fingers slipping into his hair like they belonged there, I knew he could feel the tremble in my wrists, could hear the sound I didn't mean to make leave my throat. The first sound in years that wasn't a sigh or a complaint or a half-hearted laugh, but something raw and guttural and real. I didn't cry and I didn't shake and I didn't push him away. I only let myself breathe in uneven bursts as he held his face near my skin, and I stared up at the ceiling and wondered how a room so small could contain so much rupture. And when I finally sat up and reached for my clothes, the air around us felt so dense with everything that had just happened that I couldn't meet his eyes even though I knew he wasn't going to stop me or ask me to stay. I dressed faster than usual, my fingers fumbling slightly as I pulled my top over my head and stuffed my socks into my bag, and the silence remained between us like something we'd both chosen to respect out of necessity rather than guilt. And just as I reached the door, just as my hand touched the metal handle and I thought I might be able to leave without one more moment I couldn't process, he said, "I'm not your husband. I'm your choice." His voice was steady and almost emotionless, like someone stating a weather report, and I paused with my hand still on the handle and answered without turning around, "You're my mistake." But even as the words left my mouth, they wavered, not because I didn't believe them, but because I wasn't sure I wanted them to be true. I stepped out of the room like someone leaving a scene they had both created and tried to erase, with my jacket too loosely draped over my arm, my bag slipping off my shoulder, and my breath moving in short, uneven pulls that didn't match the calm I'd rehearsed in my head. And when I reached the lobby, I didn't stop at the front desk or glance at the receptionist. I only kept walking toward the glass doors that separated the quiet safety of that space from the harsher light of the parking lot. And I saw him before I even registered the cold air, the shape of my husband stepping out of the car, keys in hand, concern already forming on his face before I was close enough to be touched. He walked toward me with that look I'd seen so many times before, that soft tension between worry and love, the expression of a man who wants to help without knowing what he's helping. And as he took a few steps closer, his eyes moved across my face and then to my clothes, landing on the half-zipped hoodie, the loose hair that had slipped from the tie I didn't bother fixing, the slight flush on my chest that hadn't faded in time, and his eyebrows pulled together just slightly as he asked, "Were you crying?" With a voice that tried to be casual but cracked right at the edge of the last word. I nodded without thinking, too fast and too shallow, and said, "It was a really deep massage," hoping the words would sound convincing because they were technically true, because something had been pressed out of me on that table that had been buried so far down, I didn't know it was still alive. And when he stepped closer and took my hand, lifting it gently to his lips like he'd done 100 times, without ever making it feel rehearsed, I let the kiss land on my skin and didn't pull away until it lingered a beat longer than comfort allowed. Because I needed to feel something familiar, even if it wasn't enough to undo what had just happened. We drove home with the windows closed and the heater low, and I could feel the space between us pulse like a second heartbeat neither of us wanted to acknowledge. And when he reached across the console and rested his palm lightly on my knee like he always did during quiet drives, I nodded as if to say I noticed, as if to say it was okay. But all I could feel was the hollowness of the gesture, the way his touch landed on skin that didn't feel like mine anymore, as if his hand was resting on the ghost of someone I used to be and couldn't fully return to. Later that night, after the silence had stretched long enough to become habit again, I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my hands, screen still lit from the calendar app I pretended to check, and the message came in like it knew exactly when I'd be most likely to open it. His name in gray letters at the top and, beneath it, the sentence that pushed something sharp into the space behind my ribs. "You still carry my scent, even if you say you don't remember." I stared at it with no expression, no breath, no noise, just the dull thrum of something unwelcome spreading through my chest, and without hesitation I deleted the message, watched it vanish into the void of things I refused to save, and then flicked my phone into airplane mode with a trembling thumb, not because I was afraid he'd write again, but because I wasn't sure I'd be able to ignore it if he did. My husband came into the room a few minutes later, carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea the way he always did when I looked restless before bed. And he didn't ask why the lights were still on, or why I hadn't moved from the same position in over 10 minutes. He just handed me the mug with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and sat beside me without saying a word, and I hated how kind it felt because I didn't deserve it. I lay awake long after the lights were off, the tea untouched on my nightstand, the sheets pulled too tightly around my legs, and when I finally drifted into something that almost felt like sleep, I woke up 30 minutes later with my heart racing and my skin too warm and my thoughts in places I didn't want them to return to. And he stirred beside me, reaching for me in the dark with the ease of someone who knew the shape of my sleep. His hand found my hip and rested there gently, fingers curling just enough to say I'm here, just enough to remind me of who I was supposed to be, and I let him hold me like that for a few seconds before shifting slightly away. Not enough for him to notice, just enough to breathe again, and when he whispered, "Still not sleeping?" I nodded against the pillow, my voice too thin to answer out loud, because the truth was I wasn't awake from dreams. I was awake from everything that wasn't. It started with the shift in control, not explosive or dramatic, not a conversation, or a decision we acknowledged. Just a message that appeared on my phone one quiet afternoon while I was folding towels in the laundry room. My hands moving automatically while my thoughts stayed locked in the smell of eucalyptus and heat and memory. And when I opened the app, there were no appointment options to choose from, no suggested slots or availability windows, just a short line of text from Nathan that read, "Empty room. You know where." There was no time attached, no greeting or closing, no professional header or logo, just the cold certainty of someone who already knew the answer. And I didn't reply or ask for clarification or pretend I didn't understand. I just slid my phone into the pocket of my jeans and kept folding towels while my chest tightened with the quiet understanding that I had never been the one setting the pace. Not really, not since the first time I hesitated to say no. When I arrived at the club later that day, the receptionist smiled and waved without checking the schedule. And I walked down the hallway with my eyes forward, my steps slower than usual, the heels of my sneakers muffled by the padded carpet that stretched toward a door I now entered without knocking. And when I stepped inside, he was already there, standing near the shelf adjusting the diffuser settings like nothing had changed, like everything we were doing could still exist under the label of wellness if we never named it. The next day, my husband found the folded receipt while cleaning out the glove compartment, a crumpled sheet from the front desk that listed a charge almost double what he remembered paying, and he walked into the kitchen with the paper between his fingers. His brow slightly furrowed, his tone even but edged with something I hadn't heard in months as he asked, "Why was this one so expensive?" And I felt my body freeze for a second before answering, my voice too calm, too ready, saying, "It's a new course. They broke the sessions into 3 stages now," which sounded rehearsed even though it wasn't, and he nodded like he believed me. But his eyes lingered too long on mine before he looked away, and the doubt was planted even if he hadn't said anything else. By the time I returned to Nathan's room the next week, there were no formalities left between us, no pretense of roles or structure, and when I entered and locked the door behind me, I didn't wait for instructions or directions or cues. I simply removed my jacket and unbuttoned the blouse I'd worn over my tank top, pulling it from my shoulders without the slow, careful pace I used to rely on to justify my hesitation. And when I turned to face him, he said nothing, only watched with the kind of stillness that didn't require permission to be felt. I sat on the table without looking at the clock, without asking how long we had or how much time he'd set aside, and he approached not from behind but from the foot of the table, his fingers wrapping gently around my ankles before he began the slow movement upward with a pressure that made my skin respond before my thoughts caught up. And he didn't speak until his hands reached my knees and paused, there, pressing lightly into the soft edges of muscle that always carried tension, no matter how still I tried to stay. "Today isn't about technique," he said, his voice low and level, his thumbs moving in slow, deliberate circles just above the bend of my legs. "Today is about you." And something in the way he said it made the air in the room feel heavier than heat alone could cause. And I closed my eyes not to block him out, but to hold myself in place, to keep the sound of my own breathing from breaking whatever thread of control I still imagined I had left. When his hand slid further upward and the silence between us cracked under the weight of movement, I didn't bite back the sound that rose in my chest, didn't hide the tremble in my breath or the way my body shifted under his touch, and my chest rose with every inhale that carried more than oxygen, And just as I thought I might fold inward under the weight of everything I hadn't said out loud, I felt him lean in close until his mouth was near my collarbone and he whispered, "You could have been happy, but you chose to be yourself." And the words didn't accuse or console. They simply existed, like truth too deep to refute. I opened my eyes slowly and sat up, brushing his hands from my legs with a movement that was more tired than resistant. And as I rose from the table, I reached for my blouse without urgency, buttoning it with fingers that no longer trembled. And when I looked at him and said, "I won't come back?" my voice was steadier than I expected but thinner than it should have been, and he nodded like he already knew, like he'd heard those words before they passed my lips. He walked to the door and opened it without question, stepping aside with that same quiet calm he'd used the first time I walked in, and though I crossed the threshold without turning back, I knew that he was still standing there after I disappeared down the hallway, and I knew that the door remained open not because he hoped I'd return, but because he was certain I would. That night, as I stood in the bathroom brushing my hair with the mirror tilted slightly away from my reflection, my phone buzzed on the edge of the counter, lighting up with a message that arrived earlier than expected and yet somehow exactly on time. And when I glanced down and saw my husband's name appear with a short line that read, "I'll pick you up at 6 no delays," I read it twice before answering with a calm, practiced response that said, "I'll be ready," and I typed it with a steady thumb even though I had no idea what exactly I'd be ready for. I didn't explain what I'd be doing or where I'd be leaving from or what kind of readiness he expected, and he didn't ask, not in follow-up texts, not in his tone, just accepted the answer as if it fit inside whatever version of reality he was still willing to believe. And I hated that it made things easier. That silence still bought time. That vagueness still bought peace. And I stood at the sink for a few more minutes staring at the frosted edge of the mirror like I might find a version of myself still worth defending if I waited long enough. The room was already dim when I stepped inside that afternoon, the blinds, half drawn, and the diffuser humming in the background with a scent I couldn't immediately place. Something warmer than mint, softer than citrus, maybe bergamot or sandalwood, something designed to quiet the senses while dulling the conscience. And I didn't say hello when I entered because that ritual was long behind us, and he didn't greet me either, just looked up from the corner where he was adjusting a folded towel and nodded once as if that was all the confirmation we needed to begin again. Walked toward the table and slipped my bag off my shoulder without letting it drop, laying it gently on the chair by the wall while I loosened the buttons of my blouse one by one with a pace that was neither rushed nor careful, just mechanical, and smooth like someone following the motions of a routine that used to carry meaning. And by the time I reached the last button, he had already stepped closer, his presence quiet but undeniable. And when I slid the shirt from my arms and let it rest across the back of the chair, I didn't cover myself, didn't adjust the straps of my tank top, didn't fold my arms across my chest like a shield. I just sat down on the edge of the table and waited. His hands didn't reach for me this time, not at first, and his voice didn't fill the space with offers or questions. He only stood beside me, eyes low, breath steady, and when he finally moved, it wasn't to begin a massage or to reposition me. It was to step behind me with the kind of slowness that was neither hesitant nor assertive, just quiet. And when he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to my bare shoulder, soft and unannounced, it landed with a finality that made the air around us pull tight. I didn't turn my head, didn't flinch or gasp or answer with any sound at all. I just closed my eyes and sat very still as the warmth of his mouth disappeared from my skin, replaced by silence that spoke louder than touch ever could. And it wasn't passion or comfort, or even temptation anymore. It was something heavier, something quiet and mutual and dangerous in its calm. And for a moment, I didn't feel like a woman making a mistake. I felt like one drowning in the aftermath of choices already made. And then, just as his hand moved to rest on the table beside mine and the weight of everything settled into my spine, we heard it. The soft, unmistakable click of the handle turning, slow and deliberate. The sound of a hand pressing down on the metal lever with the calm intention of someone who believes they belong on the other side of the door. We both froze at once, not dramatically, not in panic, but in that strange stillness that overtakes people who know they have nothing left to defend. And I looked toward the door with my blouse still open and my heartbeat suddenly louder than the hum of the diffuser. And he stepped back just slightly without breaking eye contact, his face unreadable but unshaken. And I didn't know who was about to walk through that door, didn't know what had already been seen or guessed or confirmed, but I knew that this wasn't the kind of moment you could lie your way out of. I stood quickly and reached for the back of the chair, pulling my shirt over my shoulders with a speed that made the fabric twist the wrong way, and I fumbled with the buttons as the latch clicked again and the door began to open, inch by inch, bringing with it not just the possibility of discovery, but the weight of the silence I'd been carrying for weeks, the silence that was no longer a shield but a confession written in breath and posture and the flush still rising across my skin. In that half second before the door fully opened, before I saw who stood behind it and whether their face would hold confusion or confirmation, I knew one thing with absolute clarity, that what had been unspoken could no longer stay that way, that the room which once felt like a hiding place had become a stage, and whatever part of me still believed in escape had already disappeared behind the closed buttons of a shirt that could no longer hide what it had already revealed. The sound was so soft at first I thought I imagined it, just a shift in pressure in the hallway or the click of a vent pushing warm air into the room. But then the handle turned with that steady, slow intent that didn't belong to staff or strangers, or someone uncertain about their place. And when the door opened fully and the light from the hallway cut across the floor in a sharp line that ended just beneath my bare feet, I looked up and saw him, my husband, standing motionless in the doorway with a plastic bottle of water in one hand and a face so still it made the entire room fall silent. He didn't speak right away, and in that frozen moment I could see every detail of his shock and disbelief, the way he stood motionless trying to process what he was seeing. The situation was unmistakably compromising, with Nathan and I in a position that could not be explained. As professional or innocent, and the truth of what had been happening was immediately obvious to anyone who walked in, and I knew without turning that his lips were still near my collarbone, that his posture hadn't shifted, that his refusal to step away wasn't arrogance, it was confirmation. No one moved. The air in the room went thick and slow, the kind of weight that presses into your lungs and makes you breathe through resistance. And then my husband's voice broke through it all, soft and flat and entirely detached, the tone of someone narrating the last line of a story they didn't realize had already ended. "I came early," he said, holding up the water bottle like it mattered, like it meant something now. "I thought I'd surprise you." His voice wasn't angry, wasn't shaking or sharp, or laced with the edge I'd always feared would be the weapon if this moment ever came. It was just quiet and empty and terrifying, in the way silence becomes a scream when you know what should have been said but isn't. And I didn't speak because I couldn't, because the words were stuck behind my teeth and the truth was already out in the open and there was nothing left to explain. Nathan finally stepped back, his movement slow but deliberate, as if acknowledging the reality without apology, and his voice came steady and without hesitation as he said, "I'm not sorry," like a verdict already delivered. And I didn't turn to look at him because I couldn't bear to meet eyes with someone who believed that kind of honesty was noble. My husband didn't flinch, didn't shout or accuse or ask questions he didn't want answered. He just stared for another breathless second and then said, "You don't have to be." And the way he said it wasn't bitter or sarcastic or even resigned. It was hollow, scraped clean of everything that had once filled it. "You're not the one who's been lying to me for 7 years. Then he dropped the bottle. It hit the floor with a soft thud, bounced once, then rolled unevenly until it tipped sideways and spilled its contents in a slow, widening pool across the linoleum, and still no one moved, and still no one made a sound. And he turned without looking at either of us again, walked out the door with steps so slow and deliberate they barely made a noise, and the quiet he left behind wasn't relief. It was suffocating. I stood frozen, arms at my sides, shirt still unbuttoned, chest exposed to a room that no longer felt private or protected, and then I sat down on the edge of the table because my legs didn't trust me anymore, because the cold from the floor had finally crept up into my spine, and I wrapped the towel around my body more out of reflex than modesty, shivering not from shame but from the sudden absence of everything I thought would hold me together. "It's over now," I said aloud, not to him, not even to myself, just to the space that still smelled like skin and peppermint oil. And the sound of my voice was too thin to believe, too fragile to stand on its own. And Nathan said nothing for several seconds before answering, in that same low voice I used to find calming and now only found hollow. "Now you're real," he said, not as comfort or judgment, but as observation, like someone remarking on the weather, like someone pointing out that the sun had gone down while we weren't looking. "But you're alone." The words didn't hurt because they were true. They hurt because I didn't argue. I didn't reach for his hand or ask him to stay or say I made this choice for us because I hadn't. I'd made it in silence. I'd made it in shadows. I'd made it one small surrender at a time until there was nothing left to salvage. I dressed, slowly, every movement feeling twice as heavy, and I didn't look in the mirror before leaving the room. Didn't check my reflection to see what kind of woman was staring back, because I already knew. I walked out of the building without speaking to the receptionist, whose usual polite nod I avoided by keeping my gaze low and fixed on the swinging doors that separated the soft music and warm light of the interior from the harsh gray of the parking lot where the chill evening air hit my face like consequence itself. And the moment I stepped through, the emptiness of the space where my husband's car had been parked hit me harder than any words could have. Not because I expected him to wait, but because part of me, some quiet part I'd tried to silence, still hoped he would. The drive home blurred around me as if the edges of reality had softened just enough to let me slip through unnoticed. The glowing traffic lights and familiar storefronts flickering past the windows without anchoring me to any single thought. And when I pulled into the driveway, I noticed immediately that the porch light was still on and flickering the way it always did when the sensor failed to catch, and that the curtains in the living room were drawn unevenly just like I always left them when I was rushing out the door too quickly to care. And yet everything felt different, not because the house had changed, but because I had walked back into it carrying a truth too heavy to set down. When I stepped inside, the silence didn't greet me. It confronted me, stretched through the entryway and wrapped itself around the banister, settled into the empty space where his shoes should have been, where his jacket used to hang from, the second hook on the wall, and I stood still in the center of the room with the bag sliding off my shoulder and landing quietly at my feet, not because I dropped it, but because I simply forgot to hold on. I called his name once, barely above a whisper, not because I believed he'd answer, but because I needed to hear how my voice sounded in a room that had already stopped waiting for it. And when no reply came, I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than it ever had before. And when I reached the bedroom and saw that it looked exactly as we had left it that morning, bed made, pillows aligned, his nightstand drawer half open where he always forgot to close it, I knew with absolute clarity that he hadn't come home to pack or argue or plead, but to leave. I returned to the kitchen not out of hunger or habit, but because I didn't know where else to go, and I stood near the sink, gripping the edge of the countertop while my thoughts spiraled out without direction, and when my phone buzzed from the corner where I'd left it charging, the sudden vibration startled me enough to knock a glass off the edge of the drying rack, which hit the floor and rolled under the table without breaking, like even it refused to shatter the way everything else had. His name lit up the screen in white letters on a black background, and even before I opened the message, I knew it wouldn't be a call, wouldn't be a plea or an accusation or a confession, but something quieter and far more final. And as I read the words, I felt the floor tilt just slightly beneath me, not enough to make me fall, but enough to make me understand that the ground I'd been standing on no longer existed. I transferred everything to your account. The car is now in your name, the house too. Don't call me, we're not we anymore. I read the message 3 times, each time with the same strange mix of disbelief and inevitability curling beneath my ribs. And I didn't reply, not because I didn't want to, but because there was no language that could reach him now, no phrase that could crawl across that silence and survive intact. And as the screen dimmed and the message slipped away like breath on a mirror, I sat down on the floor beside the refrigerator, not because I needed to think, but because my legs no longer trusted me to stand. The cold from the tile seeped through the fabric of my pants until it reached my spine, and the quiet in the room became something with shape and substance, pressing in from the edges like fog that knew exactly where to settle. And I closed my eyes not to rest, but to stop seeing the outline of a man who had loved me in quiet daily ways I'd long taken for granted until the moment he decided to take that love with him and leave nothing but facts behind. I had prepared myself for confrontation, had rehearsed defenses in my head for months, if not years. Imagine the sound of his voice breaking as he demanded to know why, or how, or when. Imagine the tears or the shaking hands or the accusations. Had built shields strong enough to survive shouting and slamming doors. But what he gave me instead was something far crueler because it asked nothing, offered nothing, left me nothing to fight. He had walked away without asking for an explanation. He had left without demanding a single reason. He had said goodbye in a silence so absolute I could feel it ringing in my bones. And as I sat on that cold kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and my hands in my lap like a child waiting for punishment that would never come, I realized that what I had feared all along wasn't losing him in anger or in grief or in heartbreak. It was losing him in indifference. Because he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't begged me to stop. He hadn't tried to fix what I had broken. He had simply let me go. And that was what shattered me. The morning began without sound, not the usual hum of a message buzzing through the pillowcase or the sharp ping of an email from work or a voice note from a cousin reminding me about someone's birthday I had forgotten again, just the stillness of a phone that had nothing left to offer, the screen black and cold on the nightstand, untouched since the previous day when silence had stopped being a pause and started being punishment. And as I sat up in the unfamiliar bed of the hotel room I had booked under my maiden name because the clerk didn't ask for anything more than a card and an ID, I noticed again the absence that was no longer shocking. No calls, no texts, no reminders, no anything. I opened my social media accounts out of habit, swiping through timelines that used to fill with tags and memories and half-hearted congratulations on work milestones, and I found nothing new, no comments, no likes, no shared memories from a marriage that had now been scraped off the surface of other people's feeds like dirt wiped off a shoe. And then the notification arrived like a ghost slipping through a locked door. One message, just one. And it was from his mother, the woman who once called me her daughter, who once brought me garden flowers in mismatched vases just because I said I liked yellow tulips, and the message said only this: you broke him and yourself. Maybe that's the only thing you two ever really did together. I didn't reply, not because I disagreed, but because there was nothing left to say, and by the time noon came and the coffee had gone cold in the paper cup beside the mirror, I had already opened the work app, scrolled to my team chat, and typed out a resignation so brief it could barely be called professional, citing personal reasons that no one would question because everyone already knew without knowing. And a few hours later, I received a message from the club's administrative assistant, one I had trained last year and taken out for lunch on her birthday, who now wrote, "Given the circumstances and how things may reflect on brand reputation, it's probably best if we ask for some time before returning." And I responded with a thumbs up and a single period, because the words didn't matter anymore when the weight of what they meant had already settled deep in the cavity of my chest. That night, I packed the last of my things into a suitcase that used to belong to both of us, the one he bought when we planned that trip to Portland we never took because the dates didn't align and we said we'd reschedule but never did. And as I zipped it closed with only a few clothes, a charger, and a single thin book I hadn't been able to finish, I saw the shirt lying at the edge of the bed, the soft blue one with the wide collar that slipped easily off my shoulder, the one I had worn the day Nathan kissed my skin like it meant something deeper than lust. And I grabbed it without thinking and shoved it into the waste bin beneath the desk, watching the fabric crumple in on itself paper under pressure. But an hour later, I returned to the bin, reached down without hesitating, and pulled it back out, folding it carefully as if the creases might still hold warmth from a version of myself I didn't know how to bury. And I placed it at the bottom of the suitcase like an apology no one would ever read. Nathan didn't write, he didn't call, he didn't message. He didn't linger in doorways or slip notes into lockers or wait in the parking lot like some desperate echo of what we once pretended not to be. And though part of me thought maybe he would, maybe he'd leave a sentence somewhere I could find it or a reminder of something that hadn't died. The truth was he disappeared completely and with such brutal finality that it made me wonder if he'd ever existed at all. Except I knew he had, because he still existed in me, not in my thoughts, or in my memory, but in the way my body still reacted to shadows moving past the window, in the way my skin still tightened whenever I walked too close to someone who smelled like mint or pepper or the inside of that cursed room. The divorce came not as a phone call or a conversation or a storm of accusations hurled in parking lots, but as a single file attached to an email sent late on a Tuesday afternoon with the subject line, "Final Step," and the body of the message left entirely blank except for a note beneath the PDF attachment that read, "Your signature is the last thing I need to be free." I opened the document and stared at the highlighted fields where I was supposed to type my name, where I was supposed to release him from the vows I had already shattered. And though the act took less than 2 minutes and the confirmation arrived, almost instantly it left behind a deeper emptiness than I could have anticipated. Not because he'd let me go, but because I had made it so easy. By the time the sun had set that evening and the city outside my window had faded into the hum of late-night traffic, I no longer belonged anywhere. Not to a job, not to a home, not even to my name. And the only thing that held me in place was the knowledge that I had destroyed something sacred, not with fire or fury, but with touch. It was almost closing time at the pharmacy when I stepped inside, not because I needed anything urgent, but because I couldn't stand the silence of the hotel room any longer, couldn't keep watching the shadows stretch across the same pale walls while my thoughts looped in tighter and tighter spirals that made the hours feel like punishment. So I wandered through the aisles without a list, without purpose, without the intention to buy more than maybe something that would help me sleep. Though deep down, I already knew there wasn't a capsule on the shelf that could fix what I'd done to my life. The overhead lights were too bright, almost clinical, the kind of brightness that makes you look at yourself too clearly in the mirror above the refrigerated case, and that's exactly where I was, standing in front of a row of herbal teas pretending to read ingredients I didn't care about. When I saw her, my former colleague from work, the one I used to trade glances with during long meetings, the one who once cried in the break room when her boyfriend left her, and I sat beside her with a granola bar and said everything would pass. She didn't speak when she saw me, didn't smile or wave or fake the kind of greeting people offer out of politeness. She just looked at me with eyes that didn't blink and a mouth set too tightly to form words. And then she nodded once, sharp, short, almost reflexive, and turned away before walking past me with her basket against her hip and her head held just high enough to say this wasn't an accident, that this was a choice, that the line between sympathy and disgust had already been drawn in her mind. I didn't chase her, didn't call after her, didn't try to force civility from someone who had every right to be cold, but as she walked away and turned down the next aisle, I heard it, Not from her, but from somewhere between the shelves behind me. Two voices barely louder than whispers, but clear enough to cut through the space like glass. And the word that reached my ears didn't need volume to strike: slut. It wasn't shouted or spat or even meant to confront. It was said the way people talk about damaged things, the way people whisper about broken windows or stained carpet, the way they discuss what's already been ruined so thoroughly that it becomes easier to mock than to fix. And I didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't let my body react, because the truth was I had nothing left to defend. And I knew that the word wasn't wrong, at least not in the way they meant it, not in the way it clung to my skin like something deserved. I paid for the tea I didn't want with a $20 bill that felt heavier than it should have, and left without taking the change, my feet moving quickly through the automatic doors, as if I could outpace the echo of that word still clinging to the back of my neck. And by the time I reached the hotel room again, the hallway was empty, the key card beeped too loudly in the lock, and I stepped inside with the kind of quiet that made even the floor beneath me feel accusatory. That night, my last night, I didn't cry. I didn't beg the universe for a second chance or bargain with a God I stopped believing in. Somewhere between the moment I stopped being a wife and the moment I realized I had become a memory someone else would one day lie about. Didn't light candles or drink wine or write a letter I'd never send. I didn't shower or pace or stare at the phone like it might still ring. I simply lay on the bed fully clothed with the hotel blanket pulled halfway up my legs and my hands, resting on my stomach like they were waiting for something they didn't know how to hold anymore. And I stared at the ceiling until the dim yellow light from the fixture above blurred into soft halos, and I let myself feel exactly what I had spent weeks trying to avoid: the full, raw, unfiltered weight of having made a choice so irreversible that even silence no longer offered protection. I had burned everything and everyone for a hunger I hadn't even known how to name, for a feeling I couldn't measure until it had already emptied me out, and the final thought that settled into the room, heavier than regret and quieter than grief, wasn't about Nathan or my husband or the friends who would never look me in the eye again. It was about the one thing I hadn't admitted out loud to anyone, not even myself.